So students, for today's class, we have a lecture on Rumi and Rumi's Masnavi, and we have a special guest lecture by Ms. Lubna Irfan, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Women's College. And she has already delivered, I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with her. We have already interacted with her in one of our classes on Noor Sapir, and it will be her second lecture today on Rumi and Masnavi. And we would like to, I would like to, on behalf of our entire class, thank ma'am for taking time out of your busy schedule. And I know your classes are also going on. And so should we start with it? All of you can hear me, and Lubna ma'am will speak now. So I hope all of you will be able to hear her.
Am I audible? I'm audible, right?
Yes, you're audible, Lubna. Yes. So we will start with the lecture, I think. Yes. Okay.
Okay. So I'll just start with the lecture. Today's lecture is on Rumi's Masnavi. I'm going to divide this lecture into three parts. Again, I'm going to talk about Rumi's. Going to introduce Rumi and give some biographical details of his life. Where was he born? How did his life unfold? So that would be one section of the lecture. In the other section, in the other two sections, we'll talk about the text, Masnavi, which is of our concern today. And in the last part of the lecture, we are going to discuss the specific story related to Huppu and the King Solomon. So we're going to structure our lecture in this manner. And before starting with the life and the works and the biographical details of Rumi, I am just going to give you a brief overview and a brief outline of how Rumi is viewed today, because I am sure everybody, almost all the people who are listening to me today, would be aware of Rumi, would have heard about Rumi, would have at least read one or two quotes of his. So we have Rumi, who is today seen as a vehicle of spiritual escape for the consumerist capitalist society that we have today. But Rumi is not just that. Rumi is, when you look at his work in detail, you will find much more deeper, scholarly, and mystical elements in his texts, which are, not just, which should not just be reduced to a spiritual escape for a consumeristic world. And Rumi in this consumerist society has been reduced to an object, which should not be the case. Moving ahead, we need to understand Rumi in the Sufi context. He himself was a Sufi, and Sufism, as we know, is a spiritual aspect of Islam, is the aspect of Islam which asserts on spirituality, and there are many aspects to it, but the basic tenets of Sufism are love for God, eternal love for God, God who is seen as the beloved with a capital B, and the other aspect is annihilation of self in God. So these are the two tenets, basic tenets of Sufism. You will find repetition of these ideals over and over again in Sufi texts and Sufi literature, and Rumi's Masnavi and Rumi's works are no different. So we will find a constant recurrence of these motives of the idea of annihilation of self, of losing yourself in God. So these ideals are there. These are Sufi ideals which are very apparent in Rumi's works as well. Now I'm going to start with his biographical details. Rumi was born in a Central Asian Central Asian land in a time which is full of turmoil and trouble, because the whole of Central Asia during Rumi's life and times was ravaged with Mongolian invasions. Genghis Khan and his descendants had been coming to Central Asia. They have been, wreaking havoc on the lands, and Rumi is a product of that land. Rumi was born in Balkh, which is today lies somewhere between modern day Afghanistan and Tajikistan border. He was born in 1207. His father's name was Bahauddin Walad, and Bahauddin Walad was himself a learned scholar and a Sufi in his own repute. And because of the Mongol threat, because of the constant Mongol incursions, Rumi and his family had to migrate a number of times. And it is said that at one point of time they left Balkh and reached Nishapur. Nishapur is again a Central Asian city, and in that particular place, he's supposed to have come in contact with another major Sufi, Fariduddin Attar, who had foretold his greatness. So this is something that is associated with any big name. But eventually, the point of concern for us right now is eventually the family of Rumi got settled in Konya, which is in central Anatolia, and that area, that place was originally a part of a Roman Empire, and that is why we have the term Rumi, which is associated with the scholar that we are going to deal with today. Rumi, in its sense, means Roman. So because he lived in an area which belonged to a Roman province earlier, and the name must have sustained. So that is why the term Rumi and the name Rumi is associated with him. When they reached Anatolia, that means Konya, the father of Rumi came in contact with the Sultan of the time, Alauddin Kayqubad, and he got his patronage. He established a school for himself, and he ran that school. But soon after settling there, Rumi's father died, and the functioning of this school came under one of his disciples, and Rumi was sent to study in Aleppo and Damascus. And it is said that it was in Damascus, when he was studying there, he came in contact with Ibn al-Arabi, which is another very famous Sufi thinker of Islamic thought. And Ibn al-Arabi is credited with the idea of Wahdatul Wujud, which is a very basic tenet of Sufi ideals, and we're not going to go into those details, but his interaction with other Sufis and other Sufis' interaction with him is something that is of concern for us right now. And eventually Rumi returned to Konya, and he started working in his father's school, his father's religious establishment, the school that he had established. The point of interest now is his interaction with his peer or his guide, Shams Tabriz. Now, we know that Sufis have a spiritual guide who takes them ahead in their spiritual journey, in their mystical journey. And for Rumi, that spiritual guide was Shams Tabriz. Now, some scholars have an idea that probably Shams Tabriz was nothing but an figment of Rumi's imagination, because there's so less information, and whatever is known, it is very shrouded in mystery and mystical elements because of the Sufi nature of the two personalities. So you cannot be sure that if Shams Tabriz actually existed, but there are arguments in both the on both the aspects. The concern for us right now is that Shams Tabriz had a very major influence on Rumi, and it is said the first interaction that they had, Rumi and Tabriz, is also a very interesting interaction which has been retold a number of times. It is said that once Rumi was sitting with his books because he was running the school, and an uneducated looking stranger came his way asking about the books, to which Rumi retorted that this is something that you would not understand. And suddenly the books caught fire, and to which the stranger replied that this is something that you wouldn't understand, and that person was Shams Tabriz. In another retelling of this similar story, there is a story that Shams Tabriz threw the books in water and retrieved them from water without any flaw, and this was something that brought them closer, and this was the first interaction that Rumi and Shams Tabriz had. And Rumi and Shams Tabriz remained associated for a period of 2 years, after which Shams Tabriz vanished from the vanished eventually, and was never seen by Rumi, or was never heard of him. Nobody ever heard of him after that. So this is an idea of Shams Tabriz, and Rumi was so much inspired by this personality that he named his own collection of verses, Divan, which is a collection of verses, as Diwan-e Shams, not Diwan-e Rumi, but Diwan-e Shams, after his guide. After Shams Tabriz had gone away, and like much later, Masnavi was composed. Rumi had certain disciples, certain associates with him. One of them was a goldsmith. The other, who is of concern for the text that we are dealing with today, Masnavi, is the person named Husamuddin Chalabi, and he is the person who is supposed to have written the verses of Masnavi when Rumi used to recite them. So Rumi used to recite them, and Husamuddin Chalabi was the person who used to pen them down. This is a brief biographical outline of Rumi's life and the times that he lived in and the turmoil that his family faced. Rumi eventually died in 1273. It is said that he died soon after the composition of Masnavi, which is one of the major texts. Now, apart from Diwan-e Shams and Masnavi, Rumi has also composed some prose as well, also provides some details about his life. But the more popular texts of Rumi are Diwan-e Shams and Masnavi. Now we'll come to Masnavi itself, the text. Masnavi, technically, as we had discussed in Amir Khusro's class as well, Masnavi is a type of a poem. So the name that is associated with Rumi's Masnavi is essentially a type of the poem that it is. It's a Masnavi, and it's named Masnavi. It's very simple. Rumi did not want any flowery titles for his text, and he kept it simple. We had also discussed what kind of poem a Masnavi is in the last lecture. We talked about how there is a successive rhyme scheme of A, A, B, B, C, C. I don't know anything about that, you would know. But this is something that how you define a Masnavi, which is a characteristic of Masnavi type of poem. And it's also a long poem in that sense. And Masnavi, Rumi's Masnavi, now when I say Masnavi, I'll mean Rumi's text Masnavi. And this particular text, Masnavi, was composed, started being composed in 1262. And it was completed a little before Rumi's death. The text itself contains 6 books. We are going to look at one story from book 1, but the text itself, Masnavi, is a big text, it's a huge poem, and it contains 6 books. Each book contains around 4,000 verses, and each book has its own introduction and a prologue of its own. So it's a complete book in itself. There are no epilogues in any of the books. And the 6th book is supposed to have abruptly ended and not properly concluded, which leads to speculations that probably it was left incomplete, or probably there was a 7th book which has not survived for posterity. So this is the technical aspect of the book, and the language of the text is Persian. It's a very simple language that Rumi has used. He has not used any any flowery language in his text. He's kept it simple. He's kept it very easy to understand for people. The stories are simply narrated in a very easy to understand manner, and the characters that he has used in his text, the characters, the people that he has, the names that he has used, they are very familiar characters, familiar names that must have been familiar to the audience that he was catering to. And this entire aspect, he kept it simple and kept it, familiar to the audience, is seen as an attempt to, easily perpetuate the Sufi ideals that he wanted to convey to people. So this is something that we need to understand, that it's simple and its aim is to further and to spread and to teach people the Sufi ideals and Sufi notions, because most of the stories in the text are didactic in nature. They are, they teach people, they want to, teach people the right things. So that kind of thing is there in Rumi's text and Rumi's Masnavi, and that is why, to not lose the essence of his efforts, he kept the language simple and kept the characters familiar. I'll come to the familiar characters. So he uses the characters ranging from prophets of Islam to kings who are there in Islamic history, to certain animals which will come in the text ahead, in the story ahead. So he uses these characters, these animals, these historical figures, and weaves his own stories with them, with their own messages. So now the stories that he conveys are mostly his own, but with characters which are already there in the minds of his audience. So this is something that is very interesting in Rumi's text. Some of the stories that are there in book one, apart from the story that we are dealing with, are the stories of the fall of Adam, how Adam accepted and Iblis denied the responsibility of his sin, respect paid to Moses by Pharaoh's magicians. Now, these are all stories that are narrated in the holy book of Muslims, in the historical narratives of Muslims. These are there, present in the consciousness of a Muslim audience, and that is the audience that Rumi is catering to. And interestingly, there is this introduction to book one, in which the story that we are going to read today is there. And in that introduction, if some people remember, in the last lecture on Mu'e Sepeher, we talked about how a Persian text, or a Persian text of medieval period, starts with the invocation of God, invocation of prophet, and the invocation of a Sufi master, if there is any. But in this case, in case of Rumi's Masnavi, book one does not start with those invocations, but starts with a song in dedication to the reed flute, which is a bansuri. And it's an ode to the flute, and it's a sad song that the flute is singing because of its separation from the reed bed, from its origin. So the reed has been separated from its bed, and it has been turned into a flute, and that is the separation that he is lamenting about, he's crying about, and he's sad, and that sadness is written about in this particular song of the reed flute by Rumi. And it is said, and it has been interpreted in Sufi terms, that how that separation from its origin, separation from its place of origin by the reed flute is an analogy for the separation of man from God, and that separation is something that is very crucial in all the Sufi texts. As I have already talked about, how beloved God is something that the lover, the Sufi, aspires to become, or aspires to join, and separation between the lover and the beloved, that is God, is something that is a cause of pain, a cause of trouble, and a cause of constant efforts to reach that particular higher spiritual state. So this is something that people read in the Song of the Reed, which is there in the introduction of Rumi's Masnavi's book one. So this is a brief outline of Rumi's Masnavi's introductory part. Now I'll come to the story. The story is of Huppu and Solomon. Now I'll briefly introduce the three characters that are there in the story, and the background that they have in the Islamic thought and the Islamic ideology as such. So the story is a conversation between King Solomon, Huppu, which is a bird which has been termed as Hudhud in Persian and Arabic texts. In Quran itself, it is mentioned as Hudhud, and in the Persian text of Masnavi, it has been mentioned as Hudhud. So Hudhud or Huppu, they're the same birds. And there's a crow involved in the conversation that is going on in the text. Now, the bird Hudhud appears by the name in Surah Namal of Quran, and it has been, this is a bird which is associated with wisdom and with great skill, because it can see into distant lands, and it can talk about how a particular land has a queen, and it informs about that queen to King Solomon. And this is the kind of skill that Hudhud has in Islamic mythology or in Islamic thought. Apart from that, there's a character of a crow. Now, crow is another bird, and crow has been associated in Islamic mythology with the idea of burial, because crow is a teacher of human beings, and after one of the sons of Adam had killed his brother, it was a crow who came and told the Adam's son, how to bury the dead body. So this is the background or the baggage that is associated with the crow. And then we have the King Solomon, who is seen as an ideal king by most of the kings of a medieval period. Even Mughal kings from Jahangir to Shah Jahan, they emulated his, emulated the image of Solomon. They depicted themselves in paintings, in the nature of Solomon, surrounded by birds and animals and natural creatures. Now, the one important characteristic of King and Prophet Solomon is that he could talk to animals. It is said that he had this capacity or skill to talk to animals. So that is why he has a conversation with the birds, both Hudhud and the crow. So these are the brief background of the character that is there. And now I'll start with the story. In the beginning of the story itself, there is a there's a argument. There is an intriguing declaration about languages as such. And Rumi in this particular story says how two people, even if they are very different in their tongues, very different in the language of tongue that they speak, they can still be similar and close if their heart speaks the same language. And he gives the example of a Hindu and a Turk. He says these two people whose languages are very different and whose cultures are very different, still these two people, a Hindu and a Turk, can speak, can understand each other because they have a similar language of heart. So if there is a intimacy at heart, they can understand each other despite being disparity in the language of the tongue. Apart from it, he then says, he then argues that two Turks, if even though they speak the same language of the tongue, they cannot. Sometimes they are very distant, very begana from each other because they do not speak. They're not close in heart. They do not have that intimacy of heart. So this is the kind of starting that he gives, and he gives this starting to express the idea of Solomon's skill, Solomon's capacity to speak to birds. And he says that how speaking the same language and understanding that, understanding one another is a very important notion, and it sets one free and keeps one gives one peace of heart and everything. So this is the idea of language that he builds up. This is something that I could take up from the text, and you people and Alicia would be able to better, explain it in context of literary, how it is relevant in context of literature. But this is the idea that he, starts his story with, that how languages of heart, if they are, if two people speak the same language of heart, they can come close, and they are closer to each other. Moving ahead in the story, he talks about, so the setting of the story is that Solomon has set up his tent, and he is being visited by birds who are coming to the king and talking about their own skills, talking about their own, whatever good character they have. And they are doing this in order to gain services in his, in his regiment, in his kingdom. So this is the idea that is there. This is the story how it starts. And Huku is also one of the people, one of the birds who are coming to talk about their own skills so that they can get employment with the King Solomon. And when Huku comes to King Solomon, it says that my skill or my characteristic is that I can find water beneath the surface of earth when I fly above. So this is the idea that he perpetuates, or he asserts, that I have this skill, this characteristic in which I can find water beneath the surface of the earth, the kind of water, its nature, if it is sweet or salty, its color, its place of origin, I can find everything. And that is why King Solomon should keep me as an associate, so that in his further endeavors, in his further, in his further marches, I will be able to provide water for his troops. I would be able to identify places which would have good source of water, and that would be helpful for the troops and the army of King Solomon, and King Solomon accepts this claim of Hupu, and takes Hupu in his services. To which the crow, who is also another bird who was present in the tent of Solomon, gets jealous, and the crow then, crow is seen as a smart creature, as an intelligent bird, who comes and counters the argument put forth by Hupu. And the crow argues that if Hupu or Hudhud is that talented and that skillful that he can, look at water beneath the earth, then why can't he just see a trap which encages him, which entraps him, which is there just beneath this, thin layer of earth or thin layer of mud. If you can, Crow asserts to Hupu, that if you can see water so deep beneath the surface of earth, why can't you just see a trap which entraps you, which cages you, and which is there only beneath a thin layer of mud. So this is the counter that Crow puts to Hupu's claims, and the counter was very convincing because Hupu had been captured earlier, and it gets captured. So King Solomon also starts questioning Hupu's claim. Now this response that Hupu has to Crow's claims and to Crow's questioning of his claims, this is the crux of the story, and this is something that is very significant and relevant for the entire tale. Hupu says to the King Solomon, answering his questions, he says that if I am lying, you have my head. You can, rip it off my body. I am not lying, but I'll have to say that. Then he says the main thing, that whenever fate or divine decree comes to play, then the intelligence and skill is of no use. And this is a thing that is of very major significance for the entire story, and also for the Sufi ideology that is being perpetuated through this story. We do remember the story that happened, the incident that happened between Shams Tabriz and Rumi, where Rumi, who was a learned scholar, who was running a school, and who was sitting with books having, immense amount of knowledge, and that particular incident in which the books got burnt, and Rumi, who was learned in a lot of sciences and a lot of religious knowledge as well, but he was not superior to the knowledge of Shams Tabriz, who had spiritual prowess and spiritual powers which were much superior to the knowledge and intelligence. So in this story as well, a similar hierarchy is being placed, where spiritual and divine knowledge and the idea of spiritual mystical knowledge and mystical elements is placed above the intelligence of any human being, intelligence and knowledge which is learned through books and learned through various experiments on earth. So this is something that hierarchy is being asserted here, in which Hupu says that Crow is very intelligent. Crow has argued very intelligently, but Crow has forgotten the fact, because he's a non-believer. He asserts that because of the non-belief, and because of Crow is a non-believer, that is why he has forgotten the fact that whenever God's will comes into play, fate comes into play, then no intelligence and no skill is of use. So he uses the term or the Persian that is there for the argument that Hudhud puts forward, is that chun qaza ayat shud danish bahab. So bahab means to go to sleep. Khabidan means to sleep, and the literal translation of this particular line can be that when divine decree comes to play, intelligence goes to sleep. Now, qaza is a term that has multiple meanings. It at times means death. It at times means fate, divine decree. So these are the things that the particular term destiny. So this is the meaning of qaza, and in the context of the story that we are dealing with, the more apt meaning of the term qaza is divine decree, because because he's talking about a conflict between the intelligence of the human mind and a human skill, and God's will and God's decree, and how when the two clash, when intelligence of the human mind and God's will clash, victory is always of God's will. So this is the translation of the term qaza that we are using, divine decree. And danish means intelligence. So the argument is, whenever God's will is coming to play, whenever God's decree is coming into action, then there would be no use of intelligence, then your intelligence will go to sleep. And this is the reason why he then asserts that because it was divine will that I should be entrapped or I should be caged, and that is why I was caged. My skill is still intact, my skill is still in place, but it would not be functional when there would be divine decree. So this is the Sufi ideal that Rumi is trying to perpetuate, Rumi is trying to assert to his story, and similar Sufi notions are there in his other stories in the Masnavi. I think I'll conclude here. I hope this was helpful to all of you, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Alicia.
Am I audible to all of you? Yes. Thank you so much, Lubna. And dear students, so this was an introductory lecture on Rumi and the text that has been prescribed for our syllabus, that is Masnavi, that is book 1. And it's not even the entire text that has been prescribed in the syllabus. Even in Masnavi, it's a small story that we have in our syllabus. Again, the idea of this particular course that we are dealing with, World Classics, is to make the students and make all of us familiar with texts from all over the world. So even if it's not possible for us within the time frame of a small semester to look into the entire text in details, we still want you to be familiar with the philosophies, the philosophical inclinations, philosophical attitudes of the people that we have, or the writers or philosophers that we have included in the text, so in our syllabus. So that was the basic idea behind including such philosophers. So for today's class, what we did was we tried to look into Rumi, his philosophies, his philosophical inclinations, and we also looked into one of his literary texts, that is Masnavi book 1. And in that particular text, we tried to look into one particular story in detail, that is Solomon and Hudhud, or Hudhud as the translation goes. So what I will do after this class, students, is, because ma'am has given you a very, I won't even call it an introductory lecture. It had been a very detailed lecture on the text also and on Rumi's philosophy too. So what I'll do after this class, students, is I'll send you the material, some additional reading material for Rumi. There are a couple of books that I have that will also help you. I'll also send you the text of the particular, let's say, poem or that we have, or the verse that we have in our syllabus. And I'll also send you additional material that will help you understand the text in a better manner. And after that, I'll give you a couple of days. So you go through the text, and after that, if you have any confusion with any of the material that has been sent to you, you can, always call me, or you can always request a class and we will discuss it again if need be. And I'm very sure that the lecture that was given by ma'am has been of help to all of us, including me. So thank you, ma'am, on behalf of the class. Thank you so much for, again, taking time out of your busy schedule. We all the teachers are definitely busy in trying to finish the syllabus that we have been allotted. So thank you, ma'am. So students, we will end the meeting here. Any query, any questions that you have, you can mail it to ma'am as well as to me. I will share with you ma'am's email ID as well. My email ID is something that you already have. And thank you so much, ma'am. And we will also, students, don't worry, we will share the recording of the class also. We will share with you the recording of the class for the students who have not been able to access the Zoom meeting today. So we will share that as well. And thank you so much, everyone. So we will be ending the meeting. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the meeting. Then thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Lubna, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.